I observed Paul when he was young. He was a child that liked to kill little baby animals.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In the previous episode, we spoke about unmet emotional needs. It sounds pretty harmless, right? Now, imagine being born into a powerful family. There's a lot of power that needs to be allocated, many resources that need to be distributed. What if it is, but you're just not the recipient of it? What does that feel like? You are in this family, but you're not getting what you deserve. Perhaps because you're not the firstborn or the favorite son. This idea of favoritism in the Murdaugh family isn't a theory or an invention. Multiple sources have said that Buster was Maggie's favorite child to such an extent that Paul was basically raised by the housekeeper. And, if one reverse engineers the crime and looks at Buster's attempts to be a lawyer like his father, it seems his father favored the eldest son as well, right? That Maggie favored the eldest son and so did Alex. Would you agree with that? So it's also hardly surprising that with this intrigue, and let's face it, a betrayal going on, it's a betrayal to treat one child as a second-class citizen. And so within that schema, Paul goes on to become a little detective. And why is it? He's trying to figure out what is really happening. Dynamics in families are often subtle and secret. And one has to sometimes investigate to find out what one's family's real feelings are. And so this leads to Paul becoming a little detective. And that's not good for everyone. It's not good if you're keeping secrets to have a little detective around. So one reason children are cruel to animals, and you heard a local saying that she actually had made direct observations of Paul and seen that. But one reason for that may be as a shortcut to getting attention. Not just any attention, getting the attention that you feel that you want. It's kind of a step up from playing with feces, for example, although not much of a step up. A child may be trying to understand emotionally their feelings of helplessness or powerlessness, perhaps within a scenario of another child that is got the power and potency that they want. And so it's both from the perspective of the all-powerful parent and also themselves as the victim that there might be this cruel behavior to animals. And so it might play out as, oh, are you suffering? Oh, does that hurt? Well, I know what that feels like. And now I also know what it feels like to hurt you when I don't have to. I know what it feels like to be the perpetrator of that. And the reason we're going down this psychological rabbit hole is try to figure out through Paul how someone ostensibly with all the money in the world, all the opportunities in the world, chooses to go down a dark and destructive path. How does it happen? Why does it happen? But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, if you are new to the channel, or even if you're not that new to the channel, this case is a really good example of what this channel is capable of doing in terms of deep diving, in terms of thorough analysis. If you're someone who really likes to wring a case inside out, really get to know absolutely everything about a case, well, this is what we do on this channel. We don't sort of float around from case to case like a butterfly. We tend to really get our hooks into a case and try and figure it out. And we've almost completed that process. Anyway, if you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. Now, I actually lived in a household once where a little girl would habitually harm whatever pet she had. Really upset me. I often complained to her mother. And, so she would hurt a rabbit or a guinea pig, and her mother would then just buy another one, and it would sort of repeat itself. But I think the interesting thing to note there is why this was happening. And in that particular case, her mother was very neglectful and her father absent. So can you see, it's not merely just not getting enough attention, but just that situation, without anything else, is enough to create unmet emotional needs. And some people don't know what to do when they're in that situation. They realize they're starving for something. How do I cheat this process? How do I adapt? How do I deal with this situation? And so the child might be dealing with feelings of impotency, or basically just a sense of frustrated efforts to regain potency or agency. And think about that as an analogy for the adult Alex Murdaugh. Isn't he also struggling with feelings of impotency within a sort of dynasty situation? He feels the ground slipping under his feet. He feels the carpet being pulled out from under him. He's frustrated in his efforts to gain potency and agency, perhaps because he's got other brothers, perhaps a very powerful father. Maybe he feels like he's in the shadow of his father. In other words, a victimized child may gain a sense of power by victimizing an animal, right? And so a victimized adult may gain a sense of power by victimizing those who are poor and sort of vulnerable. And isn't that what happened? If you take Paul, think about how when he was around 14 or 15 years old, he started drinking. His social media appeared to show sessions of binge drinking at various properties owned by the Murdaugh family. So you kind of get the idea that they were aware of that. Now, I know what you're thinking. You might be saying, none of this is necessarily any different to any other American kid. Some kids drink. Some kids go through that phase with animals. But the standard here is how extreme is this level of intoxication? Does every teenager get basically sued for BUI, boating under the influence? No, clearly not. Does every student, every kid deal with a situation where while they're doing something, somebody dies? And so what the boat incident shows is that within a group of 6, not only does Paul seem to excel at alcohol consumption, more importantly, he becomes someone else. That is such a huge insight into this case. Why does he become someone else? Well, because he's forced to pretend to be whatever mask he is within the family construct. In fact, he so regularly occupies this alter ego, it manifests so often that his friends have even given the shadow self a name, Timmy. In the Deadly Dynasty series, near the end of episode 1, Paul is described not just as drunk, but a vicious drunk. It happens to fit with the profile of a 4 or 5-year-old child entertaining himself by cutting up lizards and frogs. Also, when you see him in that security footage, he doesn't just go and have a couple of drinks, he has shots. The idea is to get extremely drunk, and he is so drunk that he can barely walk. He's sort of stumbling out of there. You can actually see in the security footage that after the oyster roast, Paul decides that he wants to do some drinking. And of the 6, he's out in front, headed to the bar, followed by Connor Cook. Some of the others don't even want to drink. They just go into the park. Paul is focused on drinking and kind of hard liquor, right? And all of this took place 90 minutes before the crash. When Timmy appeared, he could not be reasoned with. And so one has to wonder, is Paul and Timmy allegory for Alex and the Goblin King? Is Paul's weakness for getting drunk allegory for Alex's weakness for opioids? I mean, it seems clear the answer is yes. And isn't it also that Paul feels like he's living in his father's shadow, perhaps even to some extent his brother's shadow? And isn't that what Alex felt like in terms of his life? But the other thing is both Paul and Alex are addictive personalities. And addictive personalities are more prone to anxiety. You can't deal with your anxiety in an adaptive way, in a constructive way, in a proper way, perhaps by exercise or whatever it is. And so you do it in a maladaptive way. You drink, you dominate. This alter ego comes out. So the substance abuse is used to soothe and satiate that anxiety. And it gives you an idea just how extreme that anxiety is. And maybe not just to soothe it, to mask it as well. Now imagine the conundrum. You're an all-powerful Murdaugh, but actually inside you're a quivering blubbering blob of gingerhead insecurity. How do you face that? How do you face up to that within yourself? How do you face up to that within those around you? So isn't the real question just how much of that allegory is actually feeding into both these people, father and son? And if you say both equally, then once again you wonder, is this about deep unmet emotional needs? And both Paul and Alex are not firstborn sons. I'm not either. In ordinary families, but especially in royal families and dynasties where there are inheritances and bloodlines and so on, firstborn means everything. You are heir to the throne. You're the prince in waiting. Anyone else is spare and often feels spare. Even in ordinary families, the middle child or just the second child tends to be seen as second rate, second best, not quite as sparkly and shiny as the first. Well, unless you Vincent van Gogh, then maybe the second brother might be seen in a different way. And that then brings us to this idea of, if we're trying to think about what is the psychology, how do we unravel the psychology within this whole story, then I want you to think about it just through this idea of staging. In other words, think of criminal psychology through the lens of staging. And so what we see in this case is staging in all three criminal incidents involving Alex Murdaugh. Connor is staged to be the driver instead of Paul, right? So Paul creates this mess. Don't worry, we'll just stage it as Connor being the driver. That's sorted out. And so what Alex does there, he tries to confuse and silence the witnesses at the scene. Confuse and silence the witnesses at the scene. At the double homicide, Alex tries to manufacture an alibi. And so what he does there, the staging of the scene is to appear to be some sort of revenge killing by the boat folks. But this is very much just psychological staging. There's not much effort beyond semantics. I wasn't home, I was at my mother. Have the caregiver say something. It's just it's pageantry with words, as we saw in the Ramsey case. Say the right words and you can conjure the reality you want. Finally, in the staged roadside scene, there we see staging again. In fact, it's all very crude and clumsy when it comes down to it. It's been an easy ride, too easy, to be a sort of legal shepherd herding the flocks of sheep through legal theatrics. The trouble is, it wasn't everyone else that was out of touch with the real world. It wasn't just everyone else. Alex Murdaugh was too. And this trial that has just concluded was where he met his Waterloo. I want to conclude this psychological analysis by just touching very briefly on this idea of hunting and eminence. You know, have you noticed that trophy hunting is a leisure activity often associated with the very rich, right? And what do you see? You see very rich people going, shooting animals and sort of parading themselves as the masters of kind of the animal world in a way, right? And they can go out into the world with their weapons and with their machines and with their resources and, you know, shoot something and show their preeminence over the world. And so it's this idea that animals are little pawns in their game and they can just very easily decide, you know, the fate of this animal. And then guess what happens? Animals soon become people. You shoot animals with impunity, become shooting people with no conscience whatsoever. And so let's come back to that original question. What drives the aggression? It comes from a lifelong addiction to excess, to pleasure, to getting your way. And so when something threatens that ease, there's not only anxiety, but aggression because you don't know how to deal with that anxiety. And then also no small amount of sadism as well, because you're occupying just one corner of the real world. And so what we have here is someone who is a victim in his spiel of where he is. He is the victim. When Paul does something and it causes Mallory Beach to die, he's the victim, let's blame someone else. When Alex Murdaugh kills his wife and son, he's the victim because of his finances. And so what that psychological unraveling shows is someone who can't deal with their insecurities, with their fears, other than to cheat their way out of it. And that is, after all, the preserve of the very rich. They escape the slings and arrows of the real world in ways that many of us can't. And so when they can't, then there's this strange contortion to try and either turn themselves into the victim or to blame someone else. Okay, so I'm not going to take it further than that. I hope you found this analysis worthwhile. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.